The forest whispered secrets through ancient oaks as Lyra pressed her back against the rough bark, her chest rising and falling in desperate rhythm. 3 days of running had brought her here, to the edge of territories she'd only heard about in hushed warnings. The Shadow Moon Pack lands stretched beyond these trees, ruled by an alpha whose name struck fear into the hearts of rogues and enemies alike. Alpha Ryland Blackthorn, the executioner of bloodlines, the wolf who showed no mercy to those who crossed him. She should have kept running, should have pushed deeper into neutral territories where she might find sanctuary among the human settlements. But exhaustion weighed heavy in her bones, and the scent of fresh water called to her parched throat from somewhere within the forbidden woods. Just a drink, she told herself. Just enough to keep going. The stream bubbled clear and cold between moss-covered stones, and Lyra cupped her hands to drink greedily. The water tasted of mountain snow and pine needles, nothing like the stagnant pools she'd been surviving on. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to belong somewhere like this, where the very air hummed with pack magic and protection. That moment of peace shattered as massive hands seized her shoulders, hauling her backward against a chest that felt carved from granite. More wolves emerged from the undergrowth, like shadows given form, their eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. She'd walked straight into a patrol. "Look what we found, sniffing around our borders," the wolf holding her growled, his voice like gravel. "Another little spy." Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as they bound her wrists with silver-threaded rope that burned against her skin. The metal sang with power, designed to suppress her wolf and leave her defenseless. Not that she had much fight left in her anyway. 3 days without proper food or rest had taken their toll, and these wolves moved with the coordinated precision of seasoned warriors. They dragged her through the forest, past towering pines that seemed to lean in and watch her passage. The pack house emerged from the trees like something from a fever dreamer, sprawling manor of dark stone and gleaming windows that reflected the dying light of dusk. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and the warm glow of electric lights promised comfort she would never taste. The great hall doors opened with a boom that echoed through the space beyond, revealing vaulted ceilings and walls lined with portraits of previous alphas. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as the patrol forced her down a central aisle between gathered pack members. Conversations died as she passed, replaced by whispers and hostile stares. At the far end of the hall, a massive chair sat atop a raised dais like a throne. But it was the man occupying it that made her breath catch in her throat. Alpha Ryland Blackthorn was larger than she'd imagined, his broad shoulders filling out a black shirt that did nothing to hide the power coiled beneath. Dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that caught the light from the chandelier above, and his jaw looked strong enough to crack stone. But it was his eyes that held her captive as the patrol forced her to her knees before him. They were the colour of storm clouds, grey and turbulent, studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. Something flickered in those depths, as their gazes met surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something neither of them could name. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air between them crackled with electricity, but had nothing to do with pack magic, and everything to do with something far more primal. Lyra's wolf, dormant and suppressed by the silver bonds, stirred for the first time in days. A low whine built in her throat, not of fear, but of longing so acute it stole her breath. No, this couldn't be happening. Not here, not with him, not when she was bound and kneeling in the hall of her people's greatest enemy. Ryland's nostrils flared slightly, his pupils dilating as he caught her scent. His knuckles went white where they gripped the arms of his chair, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the same desperate recognition in his eyes that was tearing through her chest. "Sir," that the troll leader spoke, breaking the spell. "We found her drinking from the northern stream. She was alone, but her scent—" He paused, inhaling deeply. "She carries the scent of the Blood Moon pack." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Pack members shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons as whispers of Blood Moon spread through the crowd like wildfire. Lyra's stomach clenched as she watched Ryland's expression shudder, the moment of connection disappearing behind a mask of cold fury. "Blood Moon," he repeated, the word dripping with venom. "Victor's pack." His voice carried the weight of old grievances and fresh hatred, promising violence to any who bore that particular allegiance. Lyra opened her mouth to speak, to explain that she wasn't what they thought, but Ryland was already rising from his chair. The movement was fluid and predatory, all contained power and barely leashed violence. When he descended the steps toward her, every instinct screamed at her to run, even as another part of her wanted to bare her throat in submission. He circled her slowly, like a predator assessing wounded prey. This close, she could smell his scent pine and leather, and something wild that made her wolf pace frantically against her mental barriers. The mate bond thrummed between them, undeniable and unwanted, growing stronger with each second of proximity. "What's your name, little spy?" His voice was deceptively soft, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. "Lyra," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again with more strength. "My name is Lyra. Lyra." He tested the word like wine, rolling it across his tongue. "And who sent you here? What information were you meant to gather before returning to your alpha?" "I'm not a spy." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I don't work for anyone. I was just thirsty, and I heard the stream." His hand shot out, gripping her chin and forcing her to meet his eyes. The touch sent fire racing through her veins, the mate bond singing with joy even as her rational mind recoiled. "Don't lie to me. I can smell Victor's pack all over you. You're one of his, which makes you my enemy by blood. I'm not." The desperation in her voice surprised even her. "Please, you have to believe me. I'm not part of any pack. I'm a rogue." "Rogues don't carry pack scent," one of the pack members called out from the crowd. "Especially not Blood Moon scent." Ryland's thumb traced across her lower lip, and she couldn't suppress the shiver that ran through her at the touch. His eyes darkened further, pupils blown wide as he fought his own reaction to their proximity. "You're going to tell me everything," he said quietly. "Who you really are, why you're here, what Victor is planning. And you're going to tell me before I decide whether to make your death quick or slow." The casual way he spoke of her death should have terrified her. Instead, all she could focus on was the warmth of his hand against her skin, and the way his scent wrapped around her like a promise. The mate bond didn't care about pack politics or blood feuds. It only knew that this man was hers, and she was his, and everything else was just noise. "I can't tell you what I don't know," she said, hating how breathless she sounded. "I've never even met Victor. I was born in his territory, but I left when I was 16. I've been on my own ever since." 7 years, Ryland murmured, his eyes calculating. 7 years as a rogue, and yet you still smell like Pack. Interesting. He released her chin and stepped back, but the loss of contact felt like a physical blow. Lyra bit back a whimper, her wolf howling at the distance between them, even as her human mind knew it was for the best. This attraction, this impossible pull she felt toward Himmet, would only make things worse. "Lock her in the cells beneath the house," Ryland commanded, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Full silver restraints. I want guards posted at all times." His gaze found hers again, and she saw something that might have been regret flicker in their grey depths. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow, when you've had time to reconsider your story." Strong hands hauled her to her feet, and she stumbled as circulation returned to her legs. The pack members parted before them like a sea, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disgust. She was an enemy in their midst, a spy from the pack that had caused them so much pain. That some of them wanted her blood was written clearly in their expressions. The cells were exactly what she'd expected: stone walls, slick with moisture, silver bars that hummed with suppressive magic, and a narrow cot that looked about as comfortable as sleeping on rocks. The guards locked her in with professional efficiency, adding silver shackles to her wrists and ankles that immediately began to burn against her skin. Alone for the first time since her capture, Lyra finally allowed herself to process what had happened in the Great Hall. The mate bond. With Alpha Ryland Blackthorn, of all people. The universe had a twisted sense of humour, pairing her with the one wolf who would never believe her innocence, who would see her as nothing but an extension of the pack that had wronged him. She settled onto the narrow cot and pulled her knees to her chest, trying to ignore the way the silver burned and the way her wolf whined for her mate's presence. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had to find a way to convince him she wasn't his enemy. Because despite everything, despite the cells and the chains and the promise of death, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ryland Blackthorn might be the only person in the world who could understand the loneliness that had driven her to power. His borders. The hours passed slowly in the silver-lined cell, marked only by the changing of the guard and the gradual fading of daylight through a small window near the ceiling. Lyra dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with storm-grey eyes and the phantom sensation of calloused fingers against her skin. Even unconscious, her body ached for the mate she'd found and lost in the same devastating moment. She woke to the sound of footsteps on stone and the low murmur of voices. Dawn light filtered through the window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The guards were changing again, she realized, recognizing the ritual of keys and whispered updates. But these footsteps were different, heavier, more purposeful. They belonged to someone who moved with absolute authority through these halls. Her wolf stirred restlessly as that familiar scent reached her nose, pine and leather and wild places. Ryland appeared at her cell door like a vision from her dreams, though this version looked haggard and tired. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair was mussed as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. He'd changed from the black shirt of the night before into simple jeans and a grey sweater that somehow made him look more human and more dangerous all at once. "Alpha," the guard said respectfully, stepping aside. "Should I leave us?" Ryland's voice brooked no argument. "And tell the others to stay away from this level until I say otherwise." The guard's footsteps retreated up the stairs, leaving them alone with nothing but stone walls and silver bars between them. Ryland stood motionless for a long moment, just studying her through the bars, like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You didn't sleep," Lyra observed, taking in the signs of exhaustion written across his features. "Neither did you." His voice was rougher than it had been the night before, scraped raw by something she couldn't identify. "I can smell your restlessness from here." The mate bond hummed between them, stronger now, in the quiet intimacy of dawn. Without the crowd and the ceremony of the great hall, it was harder to ignore the pull that drew them together like magnets. Lyra found herself pressing closer to the bars without conscious thought, desperate for any lessening of the distance between them. "Tell me about Victor," Ryland said suddenly, his hands gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles went white. "Tell me about the pack that bred you." "I already told you. You told me lies." The words came out harder than he seemed to intend, and she saw him visibly struggle for control. "You told me you left when you were 16, but that doesn't explain why you still carry their scent. Pack bonds don't work that way. They fade when you're truly cast out, when you're truly alone." Lyra closed her eyes, remembering nights spent running through territories that never felt like home, always searching for something she couldn't name. Maybe, "I've never been truly alone." What does that mean? When she opened her eyes again, he was closer to the bars, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey irises, close enough that if she reached out, she could touch him. The temptation was almost overwhelming. "It means I've been searching for something my whole life," she said quietly. "Something I couldn't name or understand. And last night, when I looked at you..." She swallowed hard, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "Last night, I finally found it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and unspoken truths. Ryland's breathing had gone shallow, his eyes dilating as he processed her words. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You felt it too." It wasn't a question. He'd felt the same lightning strike of recognition, the same impossible pull that defied logic and pack loyalty and every rational thought. The mate bond didn't ask permission or check bloodlines. It simply was, undeniable and absolute. "I felt it," she confirmed, and watched something crack in his expression. "But that doesn't change what you think I am. It doesn't change the fact that you believe I'm your enemy." Ryland's hand moved as if he wanted to reach through the bars, then stopped halfway. "Victor killed my father," he said, each word precise and controlled. 15 years ago, during what was supposed to be a peace summit, my father went in good faith, believing they could end the bloodshed between our packs. Victor slit his throat while the elders were discussing terms. "Ah." Lyra's heart clenched at the pain in his voice, the old grief that still bled fresh after all these years. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine. Can't you?" His laugh was bitter. "You're his blood, his pack. Everything I've done since that day has been about making him pay for what he took from me. Every strategy, every alliance, every decision, has been measured against the goal of seeing Victor's bloodline erased from this earth. The confession hung between them like a blade, sharp and unavoidable. Lyra understood now why her presence had shattered him so completely. She represented everything he'd sworn to destroy, wrapped in the form of the one person he was biologically programmed to protect above all others. "I'm not his blood," she said desperately. "I know how it looks. I know what you can smell on me. But I swear to you, I'm not related to Victor. I'm not part of his family." "Then explain the scent. Explain why you carry the markers of his bloodline if you're not connected to him." Lyra opened her mouth, then closed it again. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? The truth was a tangle of half-memories and childhood fears, pieces of a puzzle she'd never been able to solve. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've wondered about it my whole life. The pack always treated me differently, like I was something other than what I appeared to be. My mother died when I was young, and she never told me who my father was. All I know is that Victor took me in as a child, but I was never truly accepted. I was always on the outside, looking in." Something shifted in Ryland's expression, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Victor took you in?" "When I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. I don't remember much from before that. Just flashes a woman with kind eyes who sang lullabies, the smell of rain on summer nights, feeling safe." She pressed closer to the bars, willing him to believe her. "But Victor wasn't my father. I would have known. I would have felt that connection. Blood doesn't always follow the rules we expect," Ryland said slowly, but she could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "There are old magics, old bonds, that can complicate lineage. But if you're not his daughter, then what am I?" The question that had haunted her entire life spilled out before she could stop it. "Because you're right, I do carry something of his scent, something that marks me as belonging to Bloodmoon. But I've never understood why." Ryland was quiet for a long time, his eyes searching her face, as if he could find the answers written there. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its harsh edge. "There's a way to find out," he said. "Old magic, older than the packs themselves. It can trace bloodlines back generations, reveal connections that time and secrets have hidden." He paused, conflict clear in his expression. "But it requires trust and truth, and I'm not sure either of us is ready for what we might find." "I'm ready," Lyra said without hesitation. "I've been ready my whole life. Whatever the truth is, it has to be better than this uncertainty. Even if it confirms what I suspect, even if it proves you're exactly what I think you are, even then." She reached through the bars, her fingers barely brushing his, before the silver shackles sent fire racing up her arm. But that brief contact was worth the pain for the way his breath caught, for the way his eyes darkened with longing. "Because whatever this is, between us it's real, and I'd rather know the truth and lose you than live with lies and maybes." Ryland's hand closed around hers despite the silver burning them both, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "The magic requires blood," he warned. "And it requires the presence of an elder who can interpret the results. If I do this, if I bring in my grandmother to perform the ritual, there's no going back. Whatever we learn will determine whether you live or die." "Then I guess we'd better hope for good news," Lyra said, trying for levity even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Ryland's grip tightened for a moment before he reluctantly released her hand. "I'll need time to prepare. The ritual can't be performed lightly, and I'll have to convince the council that you're worth the risk." He stepped back from the bars, already transforming back into the alpha, who commanded absolute loyalty. "Until then, you stay here. No visitors except me, Ryland." His name felt foreign and perfect on her tongue. He paused at the foot of the stairs, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Thank you for believing me enough to try. Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "You might not like what we find." But he was wrong. Whatever the truth revealed about her heritage, whatever blood ran through her veins, she would face it gladly if it meant the possibility of a future with the man who was walking away from her now. The mate bond sang its approval as she watched him disappear up the stairs, already counting the hours until she would see him again. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Guards brought her food and water at regular intervals, but none would meet her eyes or answer her questions about the ritual Ryland had mentioned. She could hear activity throughout the house above footsteps, muffled conversations, the sound of furniture being moved. Whatever preparations were necessary for the bloodline magic, they were extensive. As evening approached, the quality of light filtering through her small window began to change. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear wolves beginning their nightly songs. The sound made her own wolf pace restlessly, longing to join the chorus even as the silver shackles kept her suppressed and earthbound. Footsteps on the stairs announced a visitor, but these weren't Ryland's confident strides. The person descending moved carefully, with the measured pace of someone who had learned to respect the weight of years. When the figure came into view, Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The woman was ancient by werewolf standards, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers that spoke of old traditions. Her skin was weathered like fine leather, marked by decades of moon-watching and ritual magic. But her eyes were sharp as flint, and the same storm grey as her grandson's. "So," the elder said, settling onto a small stool one of the guards must have brought. "You're the one who's turned my boy's world upside down?" "You must be Ryland's grandmother," Lyra said, forcing herself to remain calm despite the scrutiny of those knowing eyes. "Elder Sage," the woman corrected with a hint of amusement. "Though Ryland has called me Nana since he could first speak, and you are the puzzle that's kept him pacing the halls since dawn, wearing grooves in stones that have stood for centuries." "I'm Lyra. I know who you are, child. The question is whether you know." Sage leaned forward, her nostrils flaring slightly as she scented the air. "Interesting. Very interesting indeed. What do you smell?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the hope from her voice. "Blood moon, certainly. But underneath..." Sage tilted her head, studying Lyra with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. "There are layers to your scent, child. Old magic, old secrets, and something else, something I haven't encountered in many decades. Can you tell if I'm Victor's daughter?" Sage's laugh was like dry leaves rustling in autumn wind. "Oh, sweet girl, you're asking the wrong questions." She rose from her stool with surprising grace. "The ritual will tell us what blood flows in your veins, yes. But blood is just one kind of connection. There are bonds forged by magic, by necessity, by choices made in desperation. I don't understand. You understand. Will. Sage moved to the cell door, pulling an ornate silver key from somewhere in her robes. After tonight, many things will become clear. Whether you'll like the clarity remains to be seen. The key turned in the lock with a sound like destiny clicking into place. The cell door swung open, and for the first time since her capture, Lyra was free to stand and move beyond the silver bars. The shackles remained, burning cold against her skin, but even that small freedom felt like a gift. "Come," Sage said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Ryland is waiting, and the moon is merely full. The magic works best when Luna's face is complete." They climbed through levels of the pack house Lyra hadn't seen before, kitchens, where the scent of herbs and cooking food made her stomach growl. Common rooms where pack members looked up with curious and hostile eyes. Libraries lined with books that smelled of old paper and older secrets. At the very top of the house, Sage led her through a door that opened onto a wide balcony overlooking the forest. The moon hung heavy and silver above the trees, so close to fall that Lyra could feel its pull in her bones despite the suppressive shackles. Ryland stood at the center of the balcony, surrounded by a circle of candles that flickered in the night breeze. He'd changed again, now wearing simple black clothes that seemed to absorb the moonlight. When he looked up at their approach, his eyes reflected the candlelight like mirrors. "Is everything ready?" Sage asked, moving to a small table where various ritual implements had been arranged. "As ready as it can be." Ryland's voice was carefully neutral, but Myra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "The council is gathered below. They'll witness the results, whatever they are." Lyra's heart sank. A public revelation meant no chance for private discussion, no opportunity to prepare for whatever the magic might reveal. If the ritual confirmed her connection to Victor, the council would demand her immediate execution. If it revealed something else entirely, she wasn't sure that would be any better. "Don't look so terrified, child," Sage said kindly, though her own expression had turned grave. "The truth is rarely as terrible as our fears make it seem. Sometimes it's worse," Ryland added quietly. Sage shot her grandson a sharp look. "Pessimism doesn't serve anyone tonight. We seek truth, not judgment. The moon cares nothing for our petty pack politics." She gestured for Lyra to step into the circle of candles. "Kneel here, in the center. And you, boy, stop looming like a thundercloud and make yourself useful." Despite everything, Lyra almost smiled at the way the most feared alpha in 3 territories immediately obeyed his grandmother's crisp commands. Ryland moved to stand at the northern point of the circle, while Sage took the eastern position, leaving the southern and western points empty for whatever spirits or energies they meant to invoke. "Give me your hands," Sage instructed, approaching Lyra with a silver blade that gleamed wickedly in the candlelight. Lyra extended her shackled wrists, trying not to flinch as the elder examined the suppressive bonds. "These will interfere with the magic," Sage murmured. "Ryland, the key. Grandmother, if she shifts, she won't." Sage's voice carried absolute certainty. "Her wolf is bound by more than silver tonight. She won't risk the truth by trying to flee." It was true. Even if Lyra could have shifted and escaped, she wouldn't have. not when she was so close to finally understanding the mystery of her own existence. Ryland approached slowly, key in hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Promise me," he said quietly, as he unlocked the first shackle. "Whatever happens, whatever we learn, promise me you won't run." "I promise," she whispered, meaning it completely. The silver fell away from her wrists and ankles, taking the burning pain with it. Her wolf stirred immediately, stretching against the mental barriers that had held her for so long. But Sage was right. She felt no urge to shift or flee. The moment felt too sacred, too significant to disrupt with attempted escape. "Better," Sage said, approvingly. She raised the silver blade, positioning it above Lyra's palm. "This will hurt, that the pain passes quickly. Are you ready?" Lyra nodded, clenching her teeth as the blade sliced across her palm. Blood welled up, dark and vital in the moonlight. Sage caught the drops in a small crystal bowl, then moved to Ryland and repeated the process. His blood mixed with hers in the bowl, swirling together in patterns that seemed to shift and dance. "Blood calls to blood," Sage intoned, her voice taking on the cadence of old ritual. "Truth calls to truth, by moon and star and ancient law. Let what is hidden be revealed. Let what is forgotten be remembered. Let what is bound be acknowledged." She poured the mixed blood onto the stones at Lyra's feet, where it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The candles flared higher, casting writhing shadows across the balcony. The very air began to hum with power, raising the hair on Lyra's arms and making her skin tingle with electric sensation. "I call upon the ancestors," Sage continued, her arms raised to the moon. "I call upon the spirits of the first wolves, the original packs, the bloodlines that stretch back to the dawn of our kind. Show us the truth of this woman's heritage. Show us the bonds that tie her to what was, what is, and what may yet be." The world exploded into silver light. Lyra gasped as visions flooded her mind, fragments of memory and history that belonged to her and yet felt foreign at the same time. She saw a young woman with her own eyes running through moonlit forests, but the trees were different, younger, and the woman wore clothes from decades past. She saw a man with Ryland's strong jaw and storm grey eyes, but his hair was lighter and his face unmarked by the hard lines of leadership. More images cascaded through her consciousness. A cabin in the woods where the scent of herbs and healing magic hung heavy in the air. A woman's hands glowing with silvery light as she tended to wounds that should have been mortal. A baby crying in the darkness, while wolves howled warnings in the distance. "Impossible," she heard Ryland breathe, his voice seeming to come from very far away. The visions shifted, showing her scenes of violence and betrayal. A peaceful meeting in a forest clearing, a silver blade flashing in moonlight, blood on the ground, and the sound of grief-stricken howls echoing through the trees. But the faces were wrong, the timeline skewed. This wasn't the assassination of Ryland's father 15 years ago. It was older, deeper, the original wound that had started the blood feud between the packs. Through it all, she saw the woman with her eyes, moving like a ghost through the edges of the conflict. She was a healer, Lyra realized, someone who moved between territories to tend to wounded wolves regardless of their pack affiliation. Someone who believed in mercy and redemption even when the world around her had given in to hatred and vengeance. The final vision was the clearest of all. The healer woman standing in Victor's territory, her belly swollen with pregnancy, speaking urgently to a younger version of the Blood Moon Alpha. Not pleading for her own life, but for the life of the child she carried. A child whose father was already dead, killed in the fighting she had tried so hard to prevent. The silver light faded, leaving Lyra gasping on her knees in the center of the circle. The candles had burned down to mere stubs, and the moon had moved visibly across the sky. How long had the visions lasted? Minutes? Hours? She couldn't tell. "Remarkable," Sage said quietly, her voice full of wonder and something that might have been sorrow. "I haven't seen lineage magic that clear and detailed in 50 years. What did you see?" Ryland's voice was hoarse, as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. Lyra looked up at him, seeing the fear and hope warring in his expression. How did she explain what she'd learned? How did she put into words the truth that was both more and less than what they'd expected? "I'm not Victor's daughter," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I am connected to Blood Moon territory. The woman in the visions, she was my mother, a healer who worked with both packs, trying to prevent the violence that eventually consumed everything." "And your father?" Sage asked gently. Lyra's throat tightened as she spoke the truth that the visions had revealed. Marcus Blackthorne, Ryland's older brother. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryland stared at her as if she'd grown a second head, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been devastation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. "That's impossible. Marcus died in the fighting 25 years ago. He never had any children." "He didn't know," Lyra said, the words scraping her throat raw. "My mother never told him she was pregnant. She was a healer, caught between two packs that were tearing each other apart. When Marcus was killed, she fled to Victor's territory seeking protection. He took her in, and when I was born, he raised you as his own," Sage finished, understanding dawning in her ancient eyes. "Not out of kindness, but as a weapon. A Blackthorn child raised in Blood Moon territory, carrying the scent of his pack but loyal to his cause." "That I was never loyal to him," Lyra protested. "I left as soon as I could. I've been running ever since." "Because you were never meant to be there," Ryland said slowly, his voice hollow with shock. "You were always meant to come home." The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Marcus Blackthorne was her father, then Ryland wasn't just her mate, he was her family. The only family she had left in the world. The visions had shown her that her mother died when she was young, and Marcus had been gone long before she was born. This man who had captured her and threatened to kill her was quite literally all she had. "I need..." Ryland stepped back from the circle, running his hands through his hair. "I need to think. I need to process this." "Ryland," Sage said sharply. "The council is waiting. They'll expect an immediate report. Then tell them the truth." His laugh was bitter and broken. "Tell them that the woman I captured isn't my enemy's daughter. She's my brother's daughter. She's my niece. She's my..." He cut himself off, unable to voice the mate bond that complicated everything exponentially. "She's Pack," Sage said firmly. "Whatever else she might be, she's Shadow Moon blood. She belongs here. But Ryland was already walking away, disappearing through the balcony doors, without another word. Lyra watched him go, with her heart breaking in her chest, knowing that the truth had somehow made everything worse instead of better. "Give him time," Sage said gently, helping Lyra to her feet. "This is a shock for him. He spent 15 years believing Marcus died without leaving any legacy, learning he has a niece, that his bloodline continues." She shook her head. "It changes everything he thought he knew about himself, and his duty to the pack. And the mate bond?" Lyra asked quietly. "How do we navigate that?" Sage's smile was sad, but not without hope. "Carefully, child. Very carefully indeed." The pack house felt different, as Sage led her back through its halls. The hostile stares had been replaced by curious whispers and cautious nods of acknowledgement. Word of the ritual's results had already begun to spread, transforming her from enemy spy to lost family member in the span of a single evening. Instead of returning her to the cells, Sage led her to a guest room on the 3rd floor. It was simple, but comfortable, with a large bed covered in soft quilts and a window that looked out over the forest. After days of silver and stone, the warm wood and gentle fabrics felt like luxury beyond measure. "Rest," Sage advised, lighting a fire in the small hearth. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and you'll need your strength for what's to come." Alone for the first time since the revelation, Lyra sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had changed. She had a family, a real family, with bloodlines that stretched back generations, and a pack that was now honor-bound to protect her. But the family member she'd found was also her mate, creating a tangle of obligations and taboos that neither of them knew how to navigate. Sleep eluded her despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ryland's face when she'd spoken her father's name. The shock, the pain, the way he'd simply walked away, rather than deal with the complications her existence had created. She understood his need for space, but her wolf whined constantly for his presence, the mate bond pulling at her chest like a physical ache. Dawn brought tentative sunlight and a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, she found a young woman, about her own age, holding a tray of breakfast foods. The woman had the dark hair and grey eyes that seemed common among the Shadow Moon pack, but her smile was genuinely warm. "I'm Elena," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. "Elder Sage asked me to bring you something to eat and see if you needed anything else." "Thank you," Lyra said, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The food smelled incredible fresh bread, eggs, bacon, and fruit that must have come from the pack's own orchards. "Is there any word about the Alpha?" Elena's expression grew sympathetic. "He's been in his study all night, according to the guards. Beta Marcus found him there this morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes and staring at old pack records." She paused, studying Lyra with curious eyes. "It's true, then? You're really his brother's daughter?" "According to the bloodline magic, yes." Lyra took a bite of the warm bread, savouring the taste of herbs and honey, though I'm not sure how that changes anything practically. "Are you kidding?" Elena's eyes went wide. "You're pack royalty. Marcus Blackthorn was supposed to be Alpha before he died. He was Ryland's older brother and the designated heir. That makes you..." She trailed off, doing mental calculations. "Well, it makes you family to the Alpha, which puts you pretty high in the pack hierarchy. The politics of pack structure had never been something Lyra needed to understand as a rogue, but she was getting a crash course now. "What about the mate bond?" she asked quietly. "How do packs usually handle that? Kind of complication?" Elena's face went carefully neutral. "What mate bond?" "You can't tell me the entire pack doesn't know." I could smell it during the ritual, and Ryland certainly hasn't been subtle about his reaction. "It's not my place to discuss the Alpha's personal business," Elena said diplomatically, "but I will say that the moon goddess works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what seems like a complication is actually a solution we just haven't understood yet." Before Lyra could ask what that meant, another knock interrupted them. This time, it was Beta Marcosa man, in his 40s, with greying hair and the kind of calm presence that suggested he'd seen everything and survived it all. His resemblance to the Marcus from her visions was unmistakable, and Lyra felt a pang of loss for the uncle she'd never known. "Miss Lyra," he said formally, "the Alpha requests your presence in his study when you're ready." Elena gathered the breakfast tray and slipped out with a encouraging smile. Leaving Lyra alone with the Beta, Marcus studied her with the same intensity she'd seen in all the Shadow Moon wolves, but his expression was thoughtful rather than hostile. "You have his eyes," he said finally. "Marcus, your father. I served as his Beta before he died, and I'd know that particular shade of blue anywhere." Lyra touched her face self-consciously. She'd always wondered where her blue eyes had come from. So different from her mother's brown ones. To learn, they were a family trait, a connection to the father she'd never known, felt like receiving a gift she'd never known she wanted. "Tell me about him," she asked impulsively. "My father. No one ever spoke of him when I was growing up." Marcus's expression softened with memory. He was everything an Alpha heir should be: strong, intelligent, compassionate. He had a gift for bringing peace to conflicts, for finding solutions that satisfied everyone involved. If he'd lived to take the throne, the Beta shook his head, the packs might never have descended into the violence that's defined the last 2 decades. But he died fighting. He died trying to prevent a war that others were determined to start. There's a difference. Marcus gestured toward the door. "Come. Ryland is waiting, and he's not known for his patience on the best of days." They walked through corridors lined with portraits of previous Alphas, and Lyra found herself searching the painted faces for features she recognized. Near the end of the gallery, she stopped before a portrait that made her breath catch. The man in the painting had her eyes, and Ryland's strong jaw, his smile warm and confident as he posed in formal Alpha regalia. "That's him," Marcus confirmed quietly. "That was painted just a few months before he died." He was 25, about to challenge for the Alpha position and formally announce his intentions to seek a mate. He never found one. He was waiting for the right moment, the right person. Marcus believed deeply in the mate bond. He wanted to find his true mate rather than accept a political alliance. Marcus's smile was sad. He would have been thrilled to know he had a daughter, even if he never got to meet you. The study doors loomed ahead, heavy oak panels carved with wolves running beneath a full moon. Marcus knocked once and waited for permission before opening them to reveal a room that perfectly captured its occupant's personality. Floor to ceiling, bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from pack histories to modern business texts. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers and ledgers that spoke of the complex work of running a pack. Ryland stood with his prane back to them, staring out a large window that overlooked the training grounds. He'd changed clothes since the night before, but his shoulders still carried the tension of someone who hadn't slept. When he turned at their entrance, his eyes found hers immediately, and she felt the mate bond flare to life between them like a struck match. "Thank you, Marcus," he said without looking away from her. "That will be all." The beater withdrew, closing the doors behind him and leaving them alone for the first time since the revelation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of their impossible prey. "Situation. Did you sleep?" Ryland asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Not really." "You?" "No." He moved away from the window, circling around his desk to put the massive piece of furniture between them. The distance felt deliberate, a barrier against the pull that drew them together. "I've been thinking about what happens now." "And what did you decide?" Ryland's laugh was hollow. "That's the problem. I don't know. In 24 hours, you've gone from being my enemy to being my family to being—" He gestured helplessly between them. "This is uncharted territory." "For both of us," Lyra said softly. "I've never had family before." "Real family. And the mate bond." She took a shaky breath. "I've never felt anything like it. It complicates everything." Ryland's hands clenched into fists on the desk surface. Pack law is clear about family bonds and mate bonds, but it's never had to address what happens when they overlap. The council is already asking questions I don't have answers to. What kind of questions? Whether you'll stay with the pack or return to neutral territory. Whether you'll accept a place in our hierarchy or remain independent. Whether we'll acknowledge the mate bond or... He stopped himself, but she could guess what he'd been about to say. Or reject it, she finished quietly. Is that what you want? To reject the bond? The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Ryland's eyes searched her face, and she saw the war raging behind his carefully controlled expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is what's best for the pack." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give." He moved to a cabinet against the wall, pulling out a bottle of whiskey despite the early hour. 25 years ago, my brother made choices based on what he wanted instead of what was expected of him. He pursued a relationship with a healer from neutral territory, someone outside our pack politics. Those choices got him killed and left me to clean up the aftermath. Lyra felt a flash of anger on her father's behalf. "You're saying his death was his own fault? That falling in love was somehow wrong?" "I'm saying that alphas don't have the luxury of following their hearts." Ryland poured himself a measure of whiskey, but didn't drink it, just stared into the amber liquid. "Every decision I make affects hundreds of lives. Every relationship I form becomes a political statement. And every weakness I show gets exploited by enemies who want to see this pack destroyed. So that's what I am to you? A weakness? You're the daughter of my dead brother and my moon goddess chosen mate." The words came out raw and honest, stripping away the careful alpha mask he'd been wearing. "Your family I'm honor bound to protect, and a woman I want with every fibre of my being. You're my greatest vulnerability wrapped in the form of my deepest desire. The confession hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath with its intensity. She could see the cost of speaking those words written in the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the glass. "Ryland, don't." He held up a hand to stop her. "Don't make this harder than it already is. I've spent the night going through every option, every possible solution, and they all lead to the same place. The pack has to come first. It always has to come first." "What does that mean, exactly?" Ryland finally took a sip of his whiskey, wincing as it burned down his throat. "It means you'll have a place here, if you want it. As family, as pack. I'll acknowledge you as Marcus's daughter and give you all the privileges that come with that bloodline. But the mate bond..." He shook his head. "We can't act on it. We can't allow it to influence pack business or political decisions. It has to remain private, controlled." "Suppressed," Lyra said flatly. "Managed," he corrected. But they both knew it amounted to the same thing. The rational part of her mind understood his reasoning. She'd grown up on the edges of pack politics and knew how quickly personal relationships could become public. Scandals. An alpha who appeared to be ruled by passion rather than logic would lose the respect of his people and the fear of his enemies. But her wolf howled in protest at the suggestion of denying their mate bond, of pretending the connection between them didn't exist. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "If I say I can't live that way?" Pain flashed across his features before he could hide it. "Then I'll give you safe passage to wherever you want to go. Financial support to start a new life. Protection from Victor or anyone else who might want to use you against me." "You'd let me leave? I'd escort you to the border myself if that's what you wanted." The words seemed to cost him everything, his voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. Lyra stared at him across the expanse of his desk, taking in the man who'd been forced to choose between duty and desire since the moment he'd inherited his father's throne. She thought about the lonely years she'd spent wandering between territories, always searching for something she couldn't name. She thought about the family she'd never known she had, and the pack that was offering her a place to belong, and she thought about the pull she felt toward the man standing before her, the way her very soul seemed to sing in his presence, even when her rational mind knew they were impossible. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think, to understand what staying here would really mean. This is all happening so fast." Relief flickered in Ryland's eyes, quickly replaced by careful neutrality. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Marcus will show you around the territory, introduce you to pack members. Elena can help you get settled if you decide to stay. And you?" "I'll be busy with pack business. Council meetings, territorial patrols, the usual alpha responsibilities." He was already retreating behind his official duties, using them as a shield against the intensity of what lay between them. "So we're going to pretend this doesn't exist." Lyra gestured to the space between them, where the mate bond hummed with frustrated energy. "We're going to act like strangers? We're going to act like what we are, alpha and pack member. Uncle and niece." The formal titles sat strangely on his tongue, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "It's cleaner that way. Safer." Lyra wanted to argue, wanted to point out that the mate bond didn't care about their family connection or pack politics. It simply was, as natural and undeniable as breathing. But she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weight of leadership that had been thrust upon him too young and too suddenly. He was trying to do what he thought was right for everyone, even if it destroyed him in the process. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll try it your way." "Thank you." The words were barely audible, but she heard the gratitude and relief that coloured them. That Ryland? She waited until he looked at her again, letting him see the determination in her eyes. "If this doesn't work, if suppressing the bond hurts more than it helps, I won't pretend anymore. I won't sacrifice my happiness for pack politics, no matter how noble the intentions." He nodded once, understanding the warning for what it was. Then he was moving to the door, holding it open for her, in a gesture that was polite and distant, and absolutely nothing like the desperate way he'd touched her. Through the cell bars. The next few days fell into a pattern that was both wonderful and torturous. Elena became her constant companion, showing her around the pack territory and introducing her to the complex web of relationships that made up Shadowmoon society. They were warriors and hunters, crafters and teachers, elders who remembered the old ways, and young adults who were pioneering new ones. Everyone she met was curious about her connection to their beloved dead prince, and most were welcoming once they got over their initial surprise. She heard story after story about Marcus Blackthorne, his kindness, his wisdom, his talent for finding peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible problems. It painted a picture of a man she wished desperately she could have known. "He would have loved you," Elena said one afternoon as they walked through the Pax Gardens. "Marcus always said he wanted children someday, wanted to pass on the family traditions to the next generation." "What kind of traditions?" Lyra asked, pausing to admire a particularly beautiful rosebush. "The healing arts, for one. The Blackthorne line has always produced strong healers, going back generations. It's part of why your parents' relationship made sense, despite the pack politics involved." Elena plucked a rose and handed it to her. "Your mother was drawn to Marcus not just as a mate, but as someone who understood her calling." That evening, Sage appeared at her door with an armload of old books and journals. "Your father's healing notes," the elder explained, settling into a chair by the fireplace. "I thought you might want to learn about that side. Your heritage." The books were filled with detailed drawings of medicinal plants, recipes for healing potions, and notes about energy work that made Lyra's fingers tingle with recognition. As she read, memories surfaced of times when she'd instinctively known how to treat injuries during her years as a rogue, skills that had seemed to come from nowhere. "It's in your blood," Sage confirmed when Lyra mentioned the strange familiarity. "Healing magic runs strong in the Blackthorne line. With proper training, you could be as powerful as your father was. Would you teach me?" The request tumbled out before Lyra could second-guess herself. Sage's smile was warm and knowing. "I thought you'd never ask." Through it all, Ryland remained a distant but constant presence. She caught glimpses of him during pack meetings, heard his voice carrying across the training grounds as he worked with the warriors, occasionally passed him in the corridors of the pack house. He was always polite when they encountered each other, asking about her comfort and her integration into pack life with the careful courtesy of a good host. But his eyes told a different story. When he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The mate bond pulled constantly between them, a golden thread of connection that neither time nor distance seemed able to weaken. If anything, the forced separation was making it stronger, more desperate. The breaking point came a week after the bloodline ritual, during what should have been a routine pack gathering. Elena had convinced Lyra to attend the monthly CRAD community dinner, where all pack members came together to share food and strengthen social bonds. The Great Hall had been transformed from its formal state into something warm and welcoming, with long tables laden with dishes from every pack family. Lyra found herself seated between Elena and one of the senior warriors, listening to stories and laughter that made her chest ache with longing. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life, a place to belong. People who accepted her as family. Traditions that stretched back generations and would continue long after she was gone. But every time she looked toward the head table, where Ryland sat with the other pack leaders, the ache intensified. He belonged here in a way she never would. His presence commanding even in casual conversation, and yet she could feel his awareness of her like a physical touch. The way his attention drifted to her, despite his obvious attempts to focus elsewhere. The trouble started when pack members began sharing stories about their ancestors, tales of heroism and sacrifice that had shaped Shadowmoon history. When someone mentioned Marcus Blackthorn, the entire hall fell silent, every eye turning to Lyra with expectant curiosity. "Tell us about your mother," an elderly pack member called out. "What was she like? How did she and Marcus meet?" Lyra's throat closed with panic. She had fragments from the bloodline visions, hints and impressions, rather than clear memories. How could she speak about a woman she'd barely known, a relationship that had been hidden from her entire life? She began, then stopped as the words failed her. The silence stretched, becoming awkward and uncomfortable. She could feel judgment in some of the stares, disappointment, but she couldn't contribute to the collective memory of her father's legacy. Heat rose in her cheeks as she struggled to find something, anything, to say. Then Ryland's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The evening is late, and we've all had plenty of wine. Perhaps we should save the family histories for another time." It was a graceful exit, offered with the authority of an alpha who wasn't to be questioned. But it felt like failure to Lyra, proof that she didn't really belong here, despite the blood connections and pack acceptance. She was an outsider looking in, a stranger wearing the face of someone they'd loved and lost. She excused herself, as soon as she could manage it politely, slipping out of the great hall and into the cool night air. The pack house gardens were empty at this hour, lit only by moonlight and the distant glow from the windows above. She found a bench beneath an old oak tree and sank onto it, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. "That was my fault," a voice said from the shadows. "I should have warned you that pack dinners can become interrogations." She looked up to find Ryland emerging from the darkness, his formal dinner clothes replaced by jeans and a sweater that made him look younger and more approachable. He moved carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "I couldn't answer them," she said, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "They wanted stories about my parents, about a life I never knew existed. I felt like such a fraud." "You're not a fraud." He settled onto the other end of the bench, close enough that she could smell his scent, but far enough to maintain the careful distance they'd been practicing. "You're exactly who you're supposed to be." "Am I? Because right now I feel lost between worlds." Too much of an outsider to truly belong here, but too connected to this place to want to leave. Ryland was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the moonlight filtering through the tree branches above them. When he spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. "Do you know what Marcus used to say about the longing?" She shook her head. "He said it wasn't about where you came from or what stories you could tell. He said belonging was about what you were willing to fight for, what you were willing to sacrifice to protect." Ryland turned to look at her, his grey eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You've been part of this pack for a week, and already you're worrying about whether you fit in, whether you're worthy of the acceptance you've been given. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. It doesn't feel like enough. It's everything." The intensity in his voice made her look up, catching the fierce certainty in his expression. "You could have demanded revenge against Victor for the way he used you. You could have rejected this pack out of anger for the years of loneliness you suffered. Instead, you're trying to earn a place that was already yours by right of birth." The sincerity in his words warmed something cold and fearful in her chest. Maybe she didn't have stories to share about her parents, that she had her own experiences to offer. Her years as a rogue had taught her things about survival and adaptability that could benefit the pack. Her healing abilities, once properly trained, could serve the community in ways that honoured her father's legacy. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for stopping the questions tonight. And for this." "Don't thank me yet." Ryland's expression grew troubled. "There's something else we need to discuss. Something I learned today that changes things." Dread pulled in her stomach at his tone. "What is it?" "Victor knows you're here. One of his scouts was caught near our borders this afternoon, and when questioned, he revealed that Blood Moon Pack is demanding your return." Ryland's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "They're claiming you were kidnapped, that you're being held against your will. That's ridiculous. I came here by accident, and I'm staying by choice." "We know that. But Victor is spinning a different story to the other packs, making it sound like we're violating territorial agreements by harbouring someone who belongs to his territory." Ryland's voice was grim. "He's calling for a summit. All pack leaders, neutral ground, to discuss your rescue and the compensation he believes he's owed." Lyra's blood ran cold. She'd seen Victor's political manoeuvring before, the way he could twist situations to serve his purposes while maintaining plausible deniability. If he was demanding her return, it wasn't out of concern for her welfare, it was because her presence in Shadow Moon territory threatened something he valued. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, reading the additional tension in his posture. Ryland was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, Victor announced his intention to name an heir. Someone to take over leadership of Blood Moon Pack when he steps down. He looked at her with eyes full of regret and something that might have been apology. He named you as his chosen successor. The world tilted sideways. Lyra gripped the edge of the bench to keep from falling as the implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. Victor wanted her back not as a pack member or adopted daughter, but as his political legacy. He was positioning her to inherit everything he'd built, including the blood feud with Shadow Moon that had defined both their lives. "I won't do it," she said immediately. "I won't go back to him, and I certainly won't lead his pack. It's not that simple." Ryland's expression was pained. "If you refuse his summons, it gives him justification to attack us." He can claim we're holding you prisoner, preventing you from accepting your rightful inheritance. Other packs who owe him favors might support him. And if I go? Then you disappear into Blood Moon territory and I never see you again. The admission seemed to tear something loose in his chest. Victor will find a way to ensure you accept the leadership role, whether through persuasion or coercion. And once you're alpha, the mate bond becomes irrelevant. You'll be my political enemy, regardless of what's between us. Personally. Lyra stared at him, seeing the trapped desperation in his eyes. After everything they'd been through, after finding each other and learning the truth about her heritage, Victor was offering them an impossible choice. Destroy their relationship to avoid war, or fight a battle that could cost hundreds of lives. There has to be another option, she said desperately. Some way to refuse his claim without giving him cause for attack. I've been thinking about that all day. Ryland moved closer on the bench, close enough that their knees almost touched. There is one possibility, but it's risky, and it would require us to… What? We'd have to make the mate bond public, claim it officially before the pack and the other alphas. His voice was rough with emotion. If you're my acknowledged mate, Victor can't claim you as his heir. Mate bonds supersede pack loyalties in all our laws. Hope flared in her chest, bright and desperate. Then let's do it. Let's stop pretending and claim what's ours. Lyra. Ryland caught her hands in his touch sending electricity racing through her veins. If we do this, there's no going back. You'll be Luna of Shadow Moon Pack, with all the responsibilities and dangers that entails. Victor will never forgive the humiliation, and he'll spend the rest of his life trying to destroy us both. I'm not afraid of Victor. You should be. And you should be afraid of what claiming me will cost you. His thumbs traced across her knuckles, the gesture tender despite the gravity of his words. Being Luna means putting the pack before everything else, including your own desires. It means making decisions that will get people killed, shouldering blame for failures that weren't your fault. Living with the knowledge that every enemy I've made becomes your enemy too. Do you think I can't handle it? I think you're stronger than you know, but I also think you deserve better than the life I'm offering. His voice broke slightly on the last words. You deserve someone who can put you first, who can love you without reservation or political calculation. You deserve to be someone's entire world, not just part of their duties. Lyra pulled her hands free from his and cupped his face instead, forcing him to meet her eyes. What if I don't want someone else's entire world? What if I want to build something bigger than just a relationship, something that matters, that helps people, that creates a legacy worth leaving behind? Lyra, what if what I deserve is a partner who understands sacrifice and duty and the weight of protecting others? What if I want someone who will challenge me to be better, stronger, more than I ever thought I could be? She leaned closer, close enough that their foreheads almost touched. What if what I want is you, exactly as you are, politics and complications and all? For a moment, she thought he might give in. His eyes darkened with longing, and his hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his cheeks. The mate bond thrummed between them, singing with the rightness of their proximity. Then he pulled back, gently removing her hands from his face. The summit is in 3 days. Victor will expect an answer by then. He stood from the bench, once again putting distance between them. Think about what I've said. Think about what you're willing to sacrifice, and what you're not. And whatever you decide, know that I'll support it. Even if I choose to leave. Pain flashed across his features. Even then, he walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the moonlit garden with the weight of an impossible decision. Accept Victor's claim and lose her mate forever. Or claim the mate bond and accept a lifetime of danger and political manoeuvring. Either choice would cost her something precious, but only one offered the possibility of happiness. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Pack members worked frantically to ready for potential conflict, while messengers carried communications between territories as various alphas confirmed their attendance at the summit. Lyra found herself at the center of it all. Her very existence, the catalyst for events that could reshape the political landscape of the region. She threw herself into learning everything she could about Pack law and politics, working with Sage and the Pack's legal advisors to understand the complexities of mate bonds and inheritance rights. The more she learned, the more she realized how precarious their situation really was. Mate bonds have precedence over Pack loyalty. Elder Thomas explained during one of their sessions, but only if they're claimed publicly and consummated properly. A private acknowledgement isn't enough to override territorial law. Consummated? Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. The mate bond must be completed for it to have full legal standing, Sage said gently. It's an old law, designed to prevent false claims and political manipulation. The idea being that true mates wouldn't hesitate to complete their bond. Which meant that even if she and Ryland decided to claim each other publicly, they would have to take their relationship to its natural conclusion immediately. There would be no time for gradual intimacy or careful courtship, just the raw, primal claiming that their wolves demanded. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She'd never been with anyone before, had never felt desire strong enough to overcome her natural caution. But with Ryland, the mate bond made her body sing with need, even during their brief, careful interactions. She couldn't imagine anything feeling more right than giving herself to him completely. If only she could convince him to take the risk. She barely saw him during those 3 days of preparation. Was busy with alpha duties, meeting with his council and coordinating security for the summit. When their paths did cross, he was always surrounded by advisors or pack members, making private conversation impossible. But she felt his attention, like a physical weight, the way his eyes tracked her movements, even when he was supposedly focused on other matters. The night before the summit, she finally cornered him in his study. The door was open, and she could see him bent over territoria, maps with beta markers, planning defensive positions, in case negotiations went badly. She waited until Marcus left before slipping inside and closing the door behind her. Lyra. Ryland looked up from his maps, exhaustion clear in the lines around his eyes. You should be resting. Tomorrow will be difficult enough without. I've made my decision, she interrupted, stepping closer to his desk. He went very still, his hands freezing over the papers. And, I want to claim the mate bond. Publicly, officially, with all the legal protections that provides. She moved around the desk until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. I want to be your Luna, Ryland. Not because it's politically convenient, but because it's what my heart and my wolf are telling me is right. He stared at her for a long moment, conflict warring in his expression. You understand what that means? What we'll have to do to make it legally binding? I understand. She reached out and covered his hands with hers, feeling the tremor that ran through him at the contact. I understand that it means trusting each other completely. I understand that it means facing Victor and anyone else who tries to separate us. And I understand, but it means accepting the responsibilities of leadership, even when they're overwhelming. Lyra. Her name came out like a prayer, full of longing and desperate hope. But most of all, she continued, leaning closer until their faces were only inches apart, I understand that what we have is worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth building a life around. This time, when she cupped his face in her hands, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, like a man dying of thirst finding water. His eyes drifted closed for a moment, and she saw the exact instant when his carefully maintained control finally cracked. Are you sure? He whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Once we do this, there's no going back. No changing your mind if it becomes too difficult. I'm sure, she said firmly. The question is whether you are. His answer came, not in words, but in action, his hands fisted in her shirt, pulling her closer until she was nearly in his lap. When his lips finally met hers, it was with all the desperate hunger they'd been denying for weeks. The mate bond exploded between them, filling her senses with his taste and scent, and the overwhelming rightness of finally touching him, the way her body had been begging to. She melted against him, her hands threading through his dark hair as he deepened the kiss. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life, not just physical desire, but the soul-deep recognition of her other half, the wolf who was meant to run beside her, hunt with her, build something lasting and meaningful with her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their wolves practically howling with satisfaction at the connection. Ryland rested his forehead against hers, his hands still tangled in her hair. Tomorrow, he said quietly, Appa Summit. We'll make it official. Tomorrow, she agreed, then smiled. But tonight we plan exactly how we're going to outmaneuver Victor and every other alpha who thinks they can use you as a political pawn. His smile was sharp and predatory, the expression of a man who'd found something worth fighting for. Because if you're going to be my Luna, you need to understand that we don't just survive our enemies, we destroy them. The summit was held at Clearwater Falls, a neutral territory that had hosted inter-pack negotiations for over a century. The location was spectacular, a natural amphitheatre formed by ancient rock formations, with a crystalline waterfall providing both beauty and the sound needed to prevent eavesdropping. But Lyra barely noticed the scenery as their convoy approached the gathering site. 7 different pack leaders had answered Victor's call, their vehicles forming a loose circle around the central meeting space. She recognized some of the territorial flags from her years as a rogue Moonrise pack from the Eastern Mountains, Riverside pack from the Valley Territories, Ironwood pack from the Northern Forests. Each alpha had brought a small entourage of advisors and guards, creating an atmosphere that was part diplomatic gathering and part military standoff. Victor's delegation was the largest, positioned prominently at the head of the natural amphitheatre. Even from a distance, Lyra could see his imposing figure tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of commanding presence that made other wolves instinctively step back. He'd been the one constant in her childhood, the stern father figure who demanded perfection while never quite offering acceptance in return. "Remember," Ryland murmured as their vehicle came to a stop, "you don't owe him anything. Not loyalty, not obedience, not even courtesy. He forfeited any claim to your respect the moment he tried to use you as a political weapon." Lyra nodded, checking her appearance one final time in the mirror. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a simple but elegant dress in shadow moon colours, with jewellery that had belonged to Ryland's mother. Every detail was designed to send a message about where her loyalties lay. The other alphas were already seated in the natural stone amphitheatre when they arrived, their conversations dying as Ryland's party made their entrance. Lyra walked beside him, with her head held high, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments that followed their progress to the designated seating area. Victor's eyes found hers immediately, his expression unreadable as he took in her transformed appearance. Gone was the frightened rogue he'd known in her place, stood a woman who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world. "Alpha Blackthorn," Victor said formally as they settled into their seats. "I trust your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough," Ryland replied with equal formality. "Though I question the necessity of this gathering. Surely a simple phone call could have resolved any misunderstandings about Miss Lyra's status." "Miss Lyra?" Victor's eyebrows rose mockingly. "How refreshingly formal, considering she's been living in your territory for weeks. One might almost think you were trying to distance yourself from accusations of impropriety." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, designed to provoke Ryland into an angry response that would weaken his negotiating position. But Ryland simply smiled, the expression cold and dangerous. "I prefer to let my actions speak rather than engage in speculation," he said calmly. "Perhaps we should focus on why we're actually here." Elder Morrison from Moonrise Pack cleared his throat, calling the gathering to order with the authority of the oldest alpha present. "We're here because allegations have been made regarding the protection of pack members and territorial sovereignty. Victor Thorne has requested this summit to address what he claims is the kidnapping of his designated heir." "Kidnapping?" Lyra couldn't keep the incredulous note from her voice. "I walked into Shadow Moon territory of my own free will, and I've remained there by choice." "Choice?" Victor's laugh was harsh. "You're a young woman with no understanding of pack politics or legal obligations. How can you make an informed choice when you've been isolated from proper counsel and subjected to influences?" The implication was clear. He was suggesting that Ryland had somehow coerced or manipulated her, using the mate bond or alpha authority to override her judgment. Several of the other alphas shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the serious nature of the accusation. "What influences would those be?" Ryland asked, his voice deceptively mild. "We'll discuss that privately," Victor said, with a meaningful look toward the other leaders. "This is a family matter that doesn't require public scrutiny." "On the contrary," Elder Morrison interjected, "if you're making formal accusations of misconduct, they need to be addressed in front of witnesses. We're here to determine facts, not facilitate private negotiations." Victor's jaw tightened with frustration, but he couldn't refuse the elder's directive without appearing unreasonable. "Very well. I believe Alpha Blackthorn has used supernatural influence to manipulate Lyra's judgment. The timing of her arrival at his territory, so soon after I announced my intention to name her as my heir, is highly suspicious." "Supernatural influence?" Beta Marcus spoke up from his position behind Ryland's chair. That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have? The mate bond, Victor said bluntly, causing several gasps around the circle. It's well documented that Alpha Blackthorn has claimed a mate bond with Lyra, despite her previous loyalty to my pack. Such bonds can be artificially induced through magic or prolonged exposure to alpha pheromones. The amphitheatre erupted in whispered conversations as the other leaders processed this revelation. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger at Victor's manipulation of the truth. He was twisting their genuine connection into something sordid and calculated. The mate bond is not something that can be artificially induced, Elder Morrison said firmly. It's a gift from the moon goddess herself, recognized by all our laws as sacred and inviolate. Unless it's being used as a political tool, Alpha Rivers from Ironwood Pack added. There have been cases throughout history of false mate bonds claimed for territorial or inheritance purposes. Which is exactly my point, Victor said triumphantly. Lyra was raised in my territory, under my protection. She carries blood moon scent and has been groomed since childhood to take over leadership of my pack. The convenient appearance of a mate bond with our greatest enemy strains credibility. Ryland had remained silent throughout Victor's accusations, but now he rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator preparing to strike. You speak of Lyra as if she's property to be owned, rather than a person with her own agency. Perhaps that's why she chose to leave your territory in the first place. She didn't leave, Victor snapped. She was captured during an unauthorized border crossing and has been held against her will ever since. Is that your testimony, Miss Lyra? Elder Morrison asked formally. Were you captured and held against your will? This was the moment when she would have to choose sides, publicly and irrevocably. Lyra stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the amphitheatre. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the stone formation. I was not captured. I entered Shadowmoon territory, seeking water, knowing I was trespassing, but desperate enough to risk it. When I was found by their patrol, I was brought before Alpha Blackthorn for questioning. She paused, meeting Victor's furious gaze directly. At no point was I held against my will. I was offered the choice to leave multiple times, and I chose to stay. Because you were manipulated, because I found something I'd been searching for my entire life, Lyra interrupted firmly. A family, a place to belong, and yes, a mate bond with the man I love. The last words rang across the amphitheatre like a bell, formal and undeniable. Several of the alphas nodded approvingly. Mate bonds were considered sacred, and her public acknowledgement carried significant legal weight. But Victor wasn't finished. You were a child when you came to my territory, he said, his voice heavy with false paternal concern. Orphaned, traumatized, with no memory of your origins, I raised you as my own daughter, gave you everything you needed to thrive. And this is how you repay that kindness. By abandoning your people for the sake of a political alliance disguised as romance? You want to talk about my origins? Lyra felt Ryland's hand settle on her lower back, offering silent support. Let's discuss what the bloodline magic revealed about my true heritage. Victor went very still, clearly not expecting this turn in the conversation. Bloodline magic is notoriously unreliable. Elder Sage performed the ritual herself, with multiple witnesses present, Ryland said smoothly. The results were quite illuminating. What did you find? Elder Morrison asked, leaning forward with interest. Lyra took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. I am not Victor's daughter, biological or adopted. I am the daughter of Marcus Blackthorne, Ryland's older brother, and a healer named Elena who worked with both packs during the conflicts 25 years ago. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Pack leaders shouted questions and accusations across the stone formation, while their advisors scrambled to understand the implications. Through it all, Victor sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. Impossible, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the chaos. Marcus Blackthorne died without issue. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what you wanted them to know, Ryland said coldly. But bloodline magic doesn't lie. Lyra is Shadow Moon by birth, not Blood Moon by choice, which means your claim to her inheritance is not only false, it's an act of war against my pack. The child's mother came to me for protection. Victor protested. She was pregnant and alone, fleeing the violence that killed her mate. I gave her sanctuary. And when she died, you kept her daughter as a weapon to use against the family that should have raised her, Lyra said, pieces of her childhood finally clicking into place. You never intended for me to find happiness or belonging. You groomed me to be a tool for your revenge. Victor's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath his paternal facade. You were nothing when I found you. A bastard child, with no pack, no family, no future. I gave you purpose, a destiny worthy of your bloodline. And you're throwing it all away for a man who will discard you the moment your political value diminishes. The only person who treated me as a political tool was you, Lyra shot back. Ryland offered me a choice, something you never did. Enough, Elder Morrison said firmly, raising his hand for silence. The bloodline revelation changes the fundamental nature of these proceedings. If Miss Lyra is indeed Shadow Moon by birth, then Alpha Thorne has no legal claim to her inheritance or loyalty. Unless the mate bond is proven false, Alpha Rivers pointed out, bloodline alone doesn't override all other considerations. Then let's settle that question once and for all, Ryland said, moving to stand beside Lyra. Elder Morrison, would you be willing to officiate a formal mate bond ceremony? Here, in front of all witnesses. The request sent another wave of shock through the gathering. Formal ceremonies were typically planned for months, with elaborate rituals and pack-wide celebrations. To propose an immediate bonding was unprecedented and absolutely binding under pack law. You can't be serious, Victor sputtered. A mate bond requires preparation, proper ceremonies. A mate bond requires only the willing consent of both parties and the blessing of a recognized elder. Elder Morrison corrected. Though I must warn you, both a bonding performed under these circumstances, with so many witnesses from multiple packs, cannot be undone. You would be bound not only to each other, but to the political alliance this represents. We understand, Lyra said firmly, taking Ryland's hand. We're ready. I object to these proceedings, Victor declared, rising from his seat. This entire situation is a manipulation designed to steal my rightful heir and weaken my pack's position. I demand a formal challenge. The amphitheatre fell silent. A formal challenge was the most serious escalation possible in interpack politics, essentially a declaration of war disguised as legal process. It meant that Victor was willing to risk everything rather than accept defeat. On what grounds? Elder Morrison asked carefully. Right of prior claim, Victor said, his voice carrying across the stone formation. Lyra was raised in my territory, under my protection, for over 15 years. Regardless of her bloodline, I have the stronger legal and emotional bond. I challenge Alpha Blackthorn's right to claim her as mate, and I invoke the ancient laws of pack precedence. Lyra felt Ryland's hand tighten around hers, his entire body going rigid with tension. A challenge based on prior claim was almost impossible to refuse without losing face among the other pack leaders. And if Victor won? I accept your challenge, Ryland said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. But I propose modified terms. Single combat, alpha to alpha, with the victor earning the right to Lyra's choice-nay, her obedience. Meaning? Meaning that if you win, you earn the right to court her properly, to make your case for why she should return to your pack. But she retains the right to refuse you. Ryland's smile was sharp as a blade. If I win, you acknowledge her right to choose her own path and renounce any claim to her inheritance or loyalty. It was a clever modification, one that protected Lyra's agency while still satisfying the legal requirements of the challenge. Victor couldn't refuse without appearing to disrespect her autonomy, but accepting meant risking everything on a single fight. Single combat to submission or death? Victor asked. Submission, Elder Morrison interjected firmly. We're here to resolve a dispute, not start a war. Victor nodded, slowly, his eyes calculating as he assessed Ryland's physical condition. At 52, he was older than the Shadow Moon Alpha, but he was still powerful and experienced. More importantly, he had nothing left to lose. His entire political position depended on maintaining control over Lyra. Very well, he said finally. I accept your terms. Single combat, alpha to alpha, for the right to court Lyra according to pack law. The other pack leaders quickly cleared a space in the center of the amphitheater, forming a circle that would serve as the fighting ground. Lyra wanted to protest, to point out that this entire situation was insane. But she understood the politics involved. This was the only way to settle the dispute that wouldn't result in all-out war between the packs. Are you sure about this? She whispered to Ryland as he began removing his shirt and shoes. I'm sure, he said, though she could see the concern in his eyes. Victor was a formidable opponent, and the older Alpha had the advantage of desperation. But if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. She interrupted fiercely. You're fighting for us, for our future. The moon goddess wouldn't bring us together just to tear us apart now. He smiled at her certainty, leaning down to brush a gentle kiss across her lips. I love you, he whispered against her mouth. Whatever happens, remember that. I love you too, she whispered back. Now go show Victor exactly why he should have left us alone. The two alphas faced each other in the center of the circle, their wolves practically visible beneath their skin as they prepared to shift. Around the amphitheater, pack members held their breath, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. Elder Morrison raised his hand, his voice carrying clearly across the stone formation. By ancient law and pack tradition, these alphas will fight for the right to court Lyra Blackthorn. Combat will continue until one submits or is unable to continue. Are both parties ready? Ready, Victor growled, his form already beginning to blur as his wolf pressed against the surface. Ready, Ryland confirmed, his grey eyes locked on his opponent. Then begin. The transformation was instantaneous and breathtaking. Both men shifted in the span of a heartbeat, their human forms replaced by massive wolves that embodied the raw power of their alpha status. Victor's wolf was dark fair, brown with silver markings, scarred from decades of battles and pack challenges. Ryland's wolf was black as midnight, with grey eyes that burned like stars, lean and powerful and absolutely deadly. They circled each other warily, each looking for an opening or weakness to exploit. Victor was larger and had the advantage of experience, but Ryland was faster and younger, with the desperate motivation of a mate bond driving him forward. The first clash came suddenly. Victor lunging forward with jaws aimed at Ryland's throat. But the younger Alpha was ready, dodging aside and retaliating with a strike that sent Victor tumbling across the stone. The older wolf recovered quickly, using his superior weight to try to pin Ryland against the ground. What followed was a battle that showcased everything that made these men alphas. They fought with the intelligence of experienced leaders and the ferocity of wild animals. Each strike calculated to cause maximum damage while avoiding potentially fatal injuries. The amphitheatre echoed with the sounds of snarling and snapping, punctuated by the gasps of pack members watching the brutal display. Lyra found herself gripping the stone seat until her knuckles went white, her wolf howling silently as she watched her mate fight for their future. Every time Victor landed a hit, she felt it like a physical blow. Every time Ryland gained the advantage, her heart soared with fierce pride. The tide of battle shifted multiple times, first favouring Victor's experience, then Ryland's speed and agility. Blood stained the stone floor where claws had found their mark, and both wolves were breathing hard from the sustained combat, but neither showed any sign of yielding. Then Victor made a mistake, overconfident from a particularly successful combination of attacks. He left his left flank exposed for just a moment. Ryland seized the opportunity, his jaws closing around Victor's shoulder with bone-crushing force. The older Alpha howled in pain and fury, twisting desperately to break free. But Ryland held on, using his leverage to force Victor to the ground. For a moment, it looked like the fight was over. Victor was pinned, bleeding, with Ryland's teeth at his throat. But Victor had one last desperate gambit. Instead of submitting, he shifted back to human form, catching Ryland off guard and allowing him to slip free of the wolf's grip. The partial shift was a dangerous move that could have killed him, but it worked suddenly. Victor was behind Ryland, his arm locked around the wolf's throat in a chokehold that could render him unconscious. "Yield," Victor panted, tightening his grip. "Yield, and I'll make this quick." For a terrifying moment, Lyra thought Victor might actually win. Ryland's struggles were growing weaker as his air supply was cut off, and the older Alpha's grip seemed unbreakable. But then she remembered something her father's journals had mentioned, a healing technique that could be used to share strength across the mate bond. Without thinking, she reached out with her nascent abilities, finding the golden thread that connected her to Ryland, and pouring her own energy along it. She felt the moment the power reached him, saw his grey eyes flare with renewed strength and determination. Ryland shifted back to human form, just long enough to break Victor's hold, then immediately shifted again into a wolf that seemed larger and more powerful than before. Victor barely had time to register what was happening before Ryland's jaws closed around his throat knot hard enough to kill, but with unmistakable dominance. "I yield," Victor gasped, going limp in defeat. "I submit." The amphitheatre erupted in cheers and applause as Ryland released his opponent and stepped back, shifting to human form with fluid grace. Victor remained on the ground for a moment, breathing hard and bleeding from multiple wounds, before slowly pushing himself to his feet. "Well fought," he said grudgingly, his hand pressed to his injured shoulder. "You've earned your victory, Alpha Blackthorn." "And you've earned my respect," Ryland replied formally. "Your love for Lyra, however misguided, was genuine. I hope we can find a way to coexist peacefully going forward." Victor's laugh was bitter, but not entirely without humour. "Don't push your luck, boy. I may have lost this battle, but the war between our packs is far from over." He looked at Lyra with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Take care of yourself, girl, and remember that Blood Moon territory will always be open to you if you change your mind." It was as close to a blessing as she was likely to get from the man who'd raised her. Victor gathered his entourage and departed without another word, leaving the other pack leaders to congratulate Ryland on his victory and formally acknowledge Lyra's right to choose her own path. "Well," Elder Morrison said with satisfaction, "I believe that settles the matter of inheritance and territorial claims. Now, about that mate bond ceremony." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of formal rituals and legal pronouncements. Elder Morrison officiated the mate bond ceremony with the gravity appropriate to such a momentous occasion, speaking words that had been used for centuries to bind wolves together in partnership and love. When he pronounced them officially mated, Lyra felt something click into place. In her solar completion, she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. The ride back to Shadow Moon territory was quiet, both of them processing the events of the day and what they meant for their future. Ryland's injuries were healing rapidly thanks to his alpha constitution, but Lyra could see the exhaustion in his posture, the wavy adrenaline was finally wearing off. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, as they turned into the pack house driveway. "Everything that happened today, everything that's going to change." "Only that it took us so long to get here," she said honestly. "And that Victor couldn't find a way to be happy for us. He may yet. Time has a way of softening old grudges, especially when there are no longer fresh wounds to maintain them." Ryland helped her out of the car, his hand warm and steady in hers. "But even if he doesn't, we have everything we need right here." The pack house was blazing with lights when they arrived, and Lyra could hear the sounds of celebration already beginning in the great hall. Word of their victory and official mating had apparently travelled fast, and the pack was ready to welcome their new Luna with the enthusiasm she'd always dreamed of but never dared to expect. "Ready?" Ryland asked, pausing at the entrance to the great hall. "With you? I'm ready for anything," she said, and meant it completely. They entered the hall together, hand in hand, to thunderous applause and joyful howls from the assembled pack members. This was her family now, her people, her responsibility, and her joy. And at her side stood the man who'd fought for their love, who'd chosen her over politics and convenience and the easy path. As the celebration swirled around them, Lyra caught sight of their reflection in one of the great windows, two figures silhouetted against the warm light, surrounded by the pack that had accepted them both exactly as they were. She thought about the scared, lonely rogue who'd stumbled into Shadow Moon territory just weeks ago, searching for water and finding so much more. That woman could never have imagined this ending to her story, could never have dreamed that the enemy's territory would become home, that the alpha who'd threatened her life would become her greatest love, that the family she'd always wanted was waiting for her to claim it. But dreams, Lyra was learning, had a way of growing larger when they were shared with the right person. And as Ryland's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her closer as Elder Sage approached with a ceremonial cup of mead, she knew that their story was just beginning. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and adventures, political complexities and private joys. There would be difficult decisions to make, enemies to face, and the constant responsibility of leadership to shoulder. But there would also be quiet moments like this one, when the world narrowed down to just the two of them, and the love that had defied every obstacle placed in its path. Victor had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. She did have a destiny worthy of her bloodline. She just hadn't understood what it looked like until she'd found the man brave enough to fight for it alongside her. As the pack raised their voices in an ancient psalm of celebration, and the moon rose full and bright above the forest, Lyra Blackthorn finally understood what it meant to be home.